When the outbreak spread across the station, panic followed like a shadow. Alarms echoed through the long metal halls, and orders came quickly from command. Everyone was to be sealed in quarantine pods until testing was complete. The pods were small, self-contained rooms built to keep infection from spreading. No one could leave once the doors locked. Alex had thought it would be simple. He would get placed with another human, maybe someone from the engineering bay or medical staff. They could pass the time with conversation, maybe even laugh about the whole situation. But when his name was called and he stepped forward to receive his assignment, the officer glanced at him with pity before handing him the tablet. Pod 47. Roommate. Zira of the Kareth. Alex froze. The name hit him like a stone. Kareth. He had heard stories of them since he was a boy. Tales whispered in bunk rooms and on transport ships. They were described as monsters, towering gray-skinned warriors with eyes that glowed in the dark. Ruthless fighters who had once raided colonies on the edge of human space. He wanted to argue, to beg for a change, but the officer's voice was sharp. Assignments are final. Move along. So, with his heart hammering, Alex walked down the long corridor to Pod 47. The door slid open with a hiss, and he stepped inside. The pod was small, barely large enough for two. Two bunks were mounted on opposite walls, a metal table sat between them, and a hygiene cubicle hummed in the corner. The air smelled faintly sterile, recycled too many times. And then he saw her. Zira sat on the lower bunk, her back straight, her glowing yellow eyes following him the moment he entered. Her skin was a deep gray, like stone smoothed by years of rain, and faint markings curled along her arms in patterns he did not understand. She was tall even while seated, and her presence filled the room like a storm cloud. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The door behind Alex slid shut with a final, echoing clang, sealing them in. The sound was louder than it should have been, like the toll of a bell. Alex set his small bag on the upper bunk and forced himself to breathe. So, his voice cracked slightly. I guess we're roommates. Zira tilted her head. Her voice, when it came, was low and rumbling, as though the walls themselves carried it. It would seem so. Alex swallowed. He couldn't read her expression. Was she angry? Disappointed? Amused? The glowing eyes gave nothing away. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Alex busied himself with unpacking his bag, though there was little inside. Just a data pad, a folded uniform, and a small keepsake photo of his family back on Earth. He set the photo on the tiny shelf by his bunk, trying to ground himself with something familiar. Zira watched him but said nothing. She returned to what she had been doing before he entered, sharpening a curved blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The scraping sound filled the pod steady as a heartbeat. Alex sat down on his bunk, nerves gnawing at him. He had been told the quarantine could last weeks. Weeks in this small space with no privacy, no escape, and no one to talk to but an alien his people had feared for generations. It wasn't just fear that weighed on him. It was the unknown. He had grown up hearing only one story about her kind, that they were brutal and merciless. But now, sitting across from one in the silence of a sealed pod, he wondered if that story was the truth, or just a shadow passed down from war. He glanced up. Zira's eyes met his, glowing faintly in the dim light. He looked away quickly, his pulse quickening. This was not what he had expected at all, and somewhere deep inside, Alex felt a chill realization. This quarantine would not just test their health. It would test their ability to survive each other. The first days in the pod passed like a slow, unending dream. Silence stretched over them, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of the air recycler or the distant alarms from the station above. Alex tried to make sense of it, tried to imagine what Zira was thinking, but every glance her way only made him more nervous. He watched her move carefully around the pod, graceful despite her size. Each step was controlled, deliberate, like she was a predator in its territory, but one that did not intend to strike. When she ate, She did so with quiet precision, never making a sound, never spilling a drop of the protein paste delivered through the small slot. Alex felt awkward eating beside her. He wondered if every sound he made annoyed her, if every move he took was being judged. Do you eat that all the time?" he asked one morning, trying to start some conversation. His voice was small, almost swallowed by the humming pod walls. Zira tilted her head. "It sustains us. That is all." Alex swallowed, cheeks burning. Her voice was deep, resonant, but it lacked warmth. It was not cruel exactly, it was just alien. The word pressed against his chest. Alien. He felt small and human and fragile beside her, like a child in the presence of a force he did not understand. He tried to speak again. I mean, do you get hungry?" Zira's glowing eyes studied him. Hunger is irrelevant if one is nourished. She returned to her sharpening, the scrape of her blade echoing softly. Alex let the silence fall again. The conversation had failed, but he could not stop trying. Every day he asked small questions, little things about her routines, about her preferences, about the station itself. Each time, her answers were short, factual, and utterly unreadable. Sleep was the hardest part. At night, when the pod dimmed to a soft, unnatural blue, Alex would lie awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He imagined her eyes watching him, glowing faintly, seeing him in ways he could not see her. Sometimes, he would hear her soft breaths, rhythmic and steady, and the sound made him feel both comforted and terrified at the same time. He began to notice little things about her. The way she paused mid-step when the light flickered, the faint hum that ran through her throat when she worked, the careful way she cleaned the pod. It was mechanical, yes, but it also felt human, or as close as something so different from him could feel. On the fourth day, Alex made a mistake. He laughed at a memory, a joke from his old crew, and the sound startled him, then startled her. Zira's head snapped toward him, eyes wide, glowing brighter than usual. He froze. I am sorry," he stammered, suddenly unsure if laughter was a crime. She lowered her gaze. "You startled me. Your noise. It is not expected." Alex swallowed hard, cheeks burning again. He realized something important in that moment. They were both strangers here, trapped in a tiny space, trying to understand a world neither of them had chosen. Fear had made him small, cautious, but it had also made her cautious. And maybe, he thought quietly, that was the first step toward something. Days turned into a slow rhythm of silence, interrupted only by meals and occasional maintenance checks. Alex found himself studying her more than he admitted. She was strong, yes, physically terrifying even, but there was patience in her movements. She did not panic, did not complain, and never raised her voice. He realized she had a discipline he had never known in humans, a calmness that made him both envious and uneasy. By the fifth day, he felt a strange respect growing inside him, tangled with his fear. He could not explain it, but he began to think that maybe the stories about her kind were only half the truth. Maybe Kareth were not monsters by choice. Maybe the monsters were only the ones humans created in their minds. The silence remained, but it changed. It was no longer just oppressive. It became a space where observation mattered, where unspoken understanding slowly built like a fragile bridge between them. Alex felt it, like a pulse under the metal floor, the subtle acknowledgement that both of them were learning each other's boundaries. And in that small pod, suspended above the cold expanse of the station, two beings from entirely different worlds realized they might not be enemies after all. Alex did not yet trust her, not fully. But for the first time he felt something like hope, a feeling he had thought quarantined along with him. The fifth day in the pod began like any other, quiet, tense, almost unbearable in its stillness. Alex woke to the soft hum of the air recycler and the faint glow of Zira's eyes across the room. She was already awake, sitting cross-legged on her bunk, her blade laid across her knees. his stomach twisted with nerves. He had spent hours wondering how someone so different could exist in the same space as him without snapping, without striking, without leaving him cowering in fear. Then it happened. A shrill alarm cut through the quiet, making both of them jump. The air recycler, old and overused, began to fail, choking the small pod with the scent of overheated metal. Alex coughed violently, his eyes stinging. Panic rose like fire in his chest. I can't, he stammered, fumbling at the control panel. Lights flickered and sparks danced along the metal edges. His hands shook as he pressed buttons that did nothing. A hot, metallic smell filled the pod and his throat tightened. He realized, in a sudden, sharp moment of clarity, that he might not get out of this alone. Zira moved before he could even ask. She rose to her full height, imposing but calm, her glowing eyes scanning the panel with a focus that made Alex feel both small and grateful. Without a word, she reached out, pulling open the metal casing and revealing the tangled wires inside. "Pass me that tool," she said, her voice steady, almost soothing, though it rumbled like distant thunder. Alex hesitated. He had never worked with machinery like this in his life. He was terrified of breaking something, terrified of making her angry, but something in the way she looked at him, firm, unyielding, but not cruel, made him trust her. He handed her the wrench, his hands shaking. Zira's fingers, long and precise, twisted wires and adjusted circuits with incredible skill. Sparks flew, but she worked as if danger did not exist. Alex found himself leaning closer, watching, amazed at the strength and control in her movements. She never glanced at him, never asked for reassurance, but somehow, in the middle of a crisis, he felt a strange sense of partnership forming. Minutes passed like hours. The pod was filled with the scent of burnt metal and the faint tang of fear, but Alex no longer felt entirely alone. He handed her tools when she asked, obeying without question. He realized he was learning her rhythm, anticipating her needs. Something inside him loosened, the tight knot of fear he had carried since being assigned to this pod. Finally, with a soft hiss and the low hum of returning power, the air recycler sprang back to life. Fresh, clean air rushed into the pod, washing away the metallic stench and the suffocating panic. Alex sank to his bunk, chest heaving. "You saved me," he whispered almost to himself. Zira wiped a smear of grease from her hands, her expression unreadable, yet something flickered in her glowing eyes. "It was necessary. You would have suffocated," Alex nodded, cheeks flushed. He wanted to say more, to tell her he appreciated her, that he respected her, but words felt small, inadequate. Instead, he just sat there, breathing, feeling something he had not felt in days. Awe. For the first time, he saw her not as a monster from the stories, not as a dangerous alien to be feared, but as someone incredibly capable, strong, and human in ways he had not expected. The realization was startling, almost painful. It made him question everything he had believed about her species, about the universe, about the stories humans told themselves to feel safe. Zira leaned back against her bunk, glancing at him briefly. "Fear is a poor teacher. Observation is better." Alex swallowed and smiled faintly. "Then I guess I'm learning." For the first time, the tension between them shifted. It was no longer just fear and silence. There was respect. There was the beginning of understanding. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was the spark of something more, a fragile connection. Unspoken but undeniable, born from shared danger and mutual reliance. That night, as Alex lay on his bunk staring at the dim ceiling lights, he realized that the quarantine pod, once a prison, had become something else. A place where two strangers from worlds apart could meet on equal footing, even if only for a moment. And deep down, he could not stop himself from wondering what might come next. The quiet rhythm of the pod was broken on the 7th day. Alex had begun to relax slightly, the adrenaline of the air recycler incident fading into memory, replaced by cautious curiosity. He had even started to leave little personal touches around his bunk, a photo of his family, a small trinket from Earth, a folded paper with notes about the station's daily routines. He thought she didn't notice. He thought he had time. But he was wrong. Alex woke early that morning to find Zira holding his datapad. She had opened it, flipping through the pages of his journal, entries he had been writing to cope with the long days of isolation. His heart froze. "You're reading my journal?" he asked, voice shaking with disbelief and anger. Zira's glowing eyes met his, calm and unwavering. "I wanted to understand why you fear me, why you write about monsters." Fear and shame and anger all collided inside him. His chest tightened and the pod felt smaller than ever, like the walls were pressing in. "Because that's what everyone says about your people," he shouted. "Because that's what we've been told. And maybe they're right." The words hit him like stones as soon as they left his mouth. He had crossed a line, but he could not stop. The anger had been building, the helplessness, the fear of the unknown. It had to come out. Zira froze. Her hands rested lightly on the datapad, and her glowing eyes dimmed slightly as if reflecting the weight of his words. For the first time she looked hurt, not physically, but in a way that pierced deeper than any weapon could. "I chose to serve on this station," she said slowly, her voice lower than usual, softer. "I wanted to learn about humans, to see the truth beyond fear. But perhaps I was mistaken. Perhaps humans do not wish to see us as anything but nightmares." Alex's throat tightened. His anger faltered, replaced by guilt. He had thought he was defending himself, but instead he had hurt her. Someone who had saved his life. Someone who had shared this impossible space with him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time since the quarantine began, the pod was not just quiet. It was cold, heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken regret. Zira set the datapad down gently and turned away, folding her hands over her knees. Alex sat on his bunk, staring at her back, feeling the full force of his mistake. He had feared her for days, and now he had pushed her away when all she had ever done was act with precision and strength. The rest of the day passed in silence. They ate their meals without speaking, and even the hum of the air recycler felt oppressive. Alex tried to work on minor repairs around the pod, hoping to distract himself, but every glance toward Zira reminded him of what he had done. He felt small, unworthy, trapped by both the pod and his own words. At night, he lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying the argument over and over. He realized something painfully clear. Fear had controlled him, fear of the unknown, fear of being trapped with someone so different. But it was not fear that had caused the fracture. It was his inability to see her as more than the stories humans had told. Zira did not sleep. Alex could feel her presence across the pod, still, silent, like a shadow he could not reach. He wondered what she was thinking, what she felt. Did she hate him? Did she pity him? Or was it something more complicated? Something he could not yet understand. By the end of the night, Alex made a promise to himself. He would not speak again until he could speak truth. He would not act until he could act with respect. He had caused this fracture, but he would try to mend it, somehow. The pod, once merely small and confining, now felt like a mirror. It reflected his fear, his ignorance, and the fragile bridge that had begun to form between him and Zira. A bridge now broken, waiting for someone brave enough to repair it. And deep down, beneath the guilt and shame, Alex felt something else, determination. If this quarantine was going to end with anything worth remembering, he had to learn to see Zira as she truly was, not as the stories had told him. The pod was quieter than usual that morning. Alex had been careful, speaking only when necessary, avoiding Zira's gaze. He thought it would make things easier, thought the silence might heal the rift. But the universe had other plans. A sudden alarm shattered the quiet, a high-pitched wail that cut through the pod like a knife. Smoke began to drift under the sealed door, curling upward in thin, gray tendrils. Sparks crackled somewhere in the station's walls, and the pod shook faintly as the fire spread in the supply tunnel adjacent to them. Alex's chest tightened. Panic clawed at his throat. "We're trapped!" he shouted, coughing as smoke filled the tiny room. He banged on the walls and tried the control panel, but the locks refused to disengage. Every second made the smoke heavier, the heat more real, the fear more raw. Zira stood calmly, her eyes glowing brighter than usual, reflecting the urgency without panic. She reached for the vent panel above their bunks and pried it open effortlessly. "Climb," she said, her voice steady, almost commanding. Alex froze, fear rooting him to the floor. The vent was narrow, pitch dark, and filled with sparks that jumped unpredictably from the walls. His mind screamed at him to stay put, to find another way. But there was no other way. Zira's eyes locked onto his, glowing like twin suns in the dim haze. "Trust me," she said. Something in that voice shattered the fear building inside him. He realized that despite everything, she had been nothing but steady, nothing but precise, nothing but capable. And now, in this moment, she was offering him a choice: to survive together or perish alone. Alex swallowed hard. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the alarm. Together they climbed. Alex followed her movements, copying her rhythm, trusting her guidance with every shaky step. Sparks sizzled dangerously close to his hands. Smoke burned his eyes, but Zira's calm presence gave him courage he didn't know he had. Every time he faltered, she steadied him, her hands firm and sure on his back, guiding him forward. Minutes stretched like hours, every inch of progress an act of sheer will. Alex's lungs burned, his muscles ached, but he refused to look back. He focused only on the rhythm Zira had set, the quiet assurance in her glowing eyes. Finally, they reached the end of the vent. The smoke outside still swirled. The heat still pressed against the pod walls, but there was an open passage to safety. Zira crawled out first, then reached back, her strong hands gripping his wrists as she pulled him through. They collapsed on the cold metal floor of the tunnel, coughing, drenched in sweat, hearts pounding. Alex stared at her, seeing her in a new light. She was still alien, still Kareth, but she was also something else entirely. A savior, a protector, a force of life in the middle of chaos. Thank you," he managed, his voice raw and trembling. You saved me." Zira wiped a streak of soot from her face and gave a faint nod. "I did what had to be done. Survival is not a gift, it is a responsibility." Alex's chest tightened again, but this time it was not fear. It was awe, gratitude, and something deeper, respect that went beyond words. He realized how small and limited his earlier anger had been, how foolish it was to judge her by stories or appearances. She had shown him a strength he could never have imagined, a quiet heroism that transcended species. For the first time since the quarantine began, Alex felt the weight between them shift. The fracture from their argument still lingered, but now it was softened by shared danger, shared survival, and the undeniable knowledge that neither could have made it without the other. As they sat there, catching their breath in the dim tunnel light, Alex realized something profound. Fear had almost destroyed him, almost destroyed their fragile connection, but courage, the kind Zira had shown, could bridge the divide that fear had created. And in that moment, he understood that the true test of this quarantine pod was not just endurance, not just survival. It was trust, and for the first time Alex felt ready to take that trust, to rebuild what had been broken, and to see Zira not as a monster from the stories, but as a partner, a teacher, and perhaps something even closer to a friend. The aftermath of the fire left the pod still and quiet. The alarms had stopped, the smoke had cleared, and the small room felt different, smaller somehow, but also warmer, as if the shared danger had softened the walls around them. Alex sat on his bunk, muscles aching, clothes stained with soot, and he watched Zira carefully. She was cleaning the pod with methodical precision, her hands moving gracefully over metal surfaces, wiping away soot and grime. He realized he had never truly looked at her, not really, not as a being with thoughts, feelings, and strength beyond his imagination. His anger, his fear, and even the stories he had grown up with had blinded him. But now, after watching her save him with such calm determination, he felt something stir deep inside. Respect. Something more than respect. Something quieter, but no less powerful. Gratitude. Zira glanced up at him, her glowing eyes soft in the dim light. "You survived because you followed. That is not weakness," Alex swallowed hard. The words struck him. Weakness. Strength. He had spent so long thinking of himself as human, fragile, limited. But here, he had lived. Because of trust. Because of courage. And because of Zira. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. For saying those things about your people. I was wrong. I judged you without knowing you." Zira's eyes softened further. "Fear is understandable, but choice matters more. You chose to trust me." He nodded, looking down at his hands. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the invisible distance that had lingered between them since the journal incident. But words felt small. Instead, he let his silence carry meaning. a quiet apology in the space between them. For the first time in days, Zira approached him, sitting carefully on the edge of her bunk. She did not touch him, but the simple act of moving closer, of acknowledging his presence, was more than he had dared to hope for. "You learned something today," she said softly, "something you could not have learned in comfort or routine. You saw fear and choice. You saw courage. And perhaps, you saw me as I truly am." Alex met her gaze. The glow in her eyes, once intimidating, now seemed almost gentle. "I did," he admitted, "and I don't know how to explain it, but I'm glad it happened. Even the fire, even the smoke, even being trapped. I'm glad you were there." For a long moment, they simply sat in the small pod, the hum of the air recycler a soft, steady rhythm beneath them. Alex realized that he no longer felt the crushing weight of fear that had dominated the past week. The pod, once a cage, now felt like a small, shared world, one where two strangers could exist side by side and survive not just physically, but emotionally. Zira inclined her head slightly, a subtle gesture he had begun to understand as a form of communication in itself. Humans speak of trust and friendship, but you have begun to understand them not through words but through action. That is the true lesson. Alex smiled faintly, feeling something unfamiliar but comforting settle in his chest. "Then, I guess we're learning from each other." "Yes," Zira replied, her voice soft but firm. "And perhaps that is why survival matters less than understanding." The rest of the day passed in a new rhythm. They spoke quietly, sharing stories of their past lives. Alex told of Earth, of his family, of the mundane moments that had once seemed important. Zira spoke of her people, of the Karth traditions, of lessons in patience and discipline that had shaped her. The stories were simple, but the act of sharing created a bond that words alone could never achieve. By the evening, Alex felt a sense of peace he had not known since entering the pod. He glanced at Zira, noticing the faint markings on her arms, the way her hands moved with deliberate care, the subtle curve of her posture as she worked. She was no longer a monster, no longer a figure of fear. She was something more complex, more real, more human than he had expected. And in that small, confined space, suspended above the cold emptiness of the station, Alex understood something important. Survival alone was never enough. The true victory lay in connection, in understanding, in the fragile bonds forged when two beings trusted each other against fear, against chaos, against everything the universe threw at them. For the first time, Alex felt hope, not just for himself, but for them, for what their unlikely friendship could become. The day the quarantine doors finally opened arrived like a sunrise Alex had almost stopped believing in. The alarms had quieted, the pod doors had been scanned, and medics were moving along the corridor, clearing personnel as the tests confirmed they were free from infection. Alex stood beside his bunk, stretching stiff limbs still covered in soot stains and the faint dust of the fire. He glanced across the pod at Zira, who was adjusting her posture, her glowing eyes calm but alert. The strange bond that had formed over the past week felt heavier now, in the best possible way. It was a weight of trust, of shared trials, and unspoken understanding that words could barely capture. The medic came to their pod, checking each of them briefly. "All clear," she said, voice efficient but kind. "You're free to leave." Alex nodded, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to stay, to remain in the tiny world where he and Zira had survived fires, smoke, fear, and silence together. He had come to understand her, and in doing so, he had learned about himself, about courage, patience, and the power of seeing beyond stories and appearances. Zira stepped forward to the threshold of the pod. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the doorway, almost as if inviting him to follow. She looked at him, her eyes glowing softly in the artificial light. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "your people will learn that we are not monsters." Alex met her gaze. The fear that had once paralyzed him was gone. He could see her strength, her patience, her courage, and he could also see kindness beneath it all. He realized suddenly and clearly that survival was never just about enduring isolation or danger. It was about connection, about trust, about learning to respect the unfamiliar. "And maybe," he replied, voice steady, "my people will learn that sometimes. Monsters can be heroes." Her faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at his heart. She extended her hand, strong and sure, and he took it without hesitation. The touch was firm, warm in a way he hadn't expected from someone so alien. and it carried the weight of shared experience and mutual understanding. Together they stepped out of the pod side by side. The corridor beyond was bright, bustling with people who had never seen a Kareth up close, who would carry stories of her species filled with fear and awe. But Alex no longer cared what others thought. He had seen her for who she truly was, beyond fear, beyond legend, beyond expectation. As they walked, Alex felt something shift inside him. Humanity's strength, he realized, was not just in endurance or technology. It was in connection. It was in the courage to see beyond fear, to trust those who seemed different, to learn from them, to survive together. Zira glanced at him, eyes glowing faintly in the corridor lights. "You have changed," she said. "So have you," he replied. "And not just because of me. Because of what we faced, together." There was a quiet understanding between them, unspoken but undeniable. In that moment, the pod, the fire, the smoke, all of it felt like a crucible that had forged not only survival, but friendship. And perhaps even something deeper, something neither of them had expected when the quarantine first began. The medics waved them along, and Alex allowed himself one last glance back at Pod 47. It had been a cage, yes, but also a classroom, a battlefield, a place where fear met courage, where two strangers had discovered strength in each other. He would never forget it. Outside the pod, the station buzzed with life, but Alex and Zira walked together as if nothing in the world could separate them now. The story of fear and misunderstanding had ended. The story of trust, respect, and human, or perhaps universal, courage had begun. And as they stepped fully into the open corridor side by side, Alex realized something profound. Sharing a quarantine pod with an alien roommate had not been what he expected. It had been far more. It had been a lesson in humanity. It had been hope.